Okay, so all right, so that's all great. So what we're going to do now is probably the most contentious. I've just seen Glenn Teal come in the door. Very well timed, sir. So Glenn has been sort of the power behind obesity for some time now, and he did our first obesity guideline, which was what, 5-6 years ago, that we rolled out, and this is the new iteration. And there are some things in the guidance. Some people sent it, but in fact it's still in the draft form, and there's some fairly contentious recommendations in it. So that's why after you got it, we asked that you didn't have it. So there are quite a few things that we're going to have to, that you're going to challenge us on. And looking at it last night, I thought, oh, this is going to be interesting. So excellent. And so the other people who worked on it with you were Lynn Stewart from Eastern Health, and Nicola from Bendigo.
Why don't I sit down there as we don't actually have a... I'm happy to sit down there if you like. Yep. Okay. Afternoon.
It's mine?
Is that on?
Yep.
Oh, this one's on anyway. So, so good afternoon. This is a little bit different to the rest of the sessions. I have actually been here for half an hour or so, just seeing how you've been doing it. Because it's still in draft form, we weren't in a position to give you too much detail about it and allow you to actually review what's in there. So that is going to be a little bit harder. So what I'm actually going to do is to spend a couple of minutes just probably identifying key areas that are different in what we're proposing at the moment. And I'm happy to discuss as we go along and see what you think about things, and we'll take it from there. So you'll hopefully be aware that there was an original guideline put together in 2010, I think it came out. So we're now 7 years on, and if you think there's not a lot of evidence in the world of preterm labour, there's almost no evidence of a high level in terms of the management of obesity. So the world hasn't actually greatly moved on in the last 7 years. I think I'm right in saying that in the guideline as it stands, there would be a single high-level recommendation, which is around closing the subcutaneous layers at a caesarean section. And that is about it. And that's actually out there if you have more than 2 centimetres of adipose tissue, and that would be everyone that we operate on. And so the rest of it is largely based on consensus or case control studies or retrospective studies. So that makes it kind of challenging. But that's no different to where we were when we did the guideline originally. Probably a few key aspects that have changed or that we're recommending change. As I say, it hasn't actually been approved yet. The original guideline had a recommendation around routine ultrasound scans for women with a BMI of 35 at 35 weeks. That was based on a group of us sat around a table trying to work out what could we do to actually improve our poor ability to detect a growth-restricted baby in women who are obese. Again, not remotely evidence-based. There is actually a project going on at the moment, a research project, to try and see whether that recommendation has made any difference to anything. The proposed guideline has actually taken that concept a little bit further and said, well, you'll, I think, all be aware of the challenges around a single ultrasound scan. It gets harder as your BMI goes up, and so there is a proposal that you would be doing serial scans in women with a BMI over 40. And I think that's set out at 28, 32 and 36 weeks, because essentially a tape measure is a complete and utter waste of time when you're getting up into that sort of BMI category. Does anybody have any questions about that aspect at the moment before we move on? As I said, it might be easier just to deal with the individual changes as we go through it.
I just spoke earlier this morning, we were talking about macrosomia, and on the Hospice Institute today introduced a policy of inducing everybody at 40 weeks who had a baby that was 4 kilos or over, based on a scan of 36 weeks. And they found that the variance in scans was, what was it?
We sort of averaged around 500 grams.
500 grams variation between the estimated weight and the final birth weight. So I realise, and I think it's important that we're looking for growth restriction here, we're not looking for big babies, is that right?
Yeah, so I genuinely don't care if the baby's big. I want the baby to be big. I don't want the baby to be small. So as a general rule, it is influenced by the BMI of the woman that you're looking after. But for example, in the specific clinic that I do, where nobody comes to that clinic unless they've got a BMI of at least 40, I'd be very concerned if anybody had an estimated fetal weight below the 50th centile in that population. And they'd have even more regular scans. So yeah, absolutely, macrosomia is good. And we know that actually from outcome data for women with very high BMI, their babies do well if they're big. They don't do badly. So we have to switch off that anxiety about macrosomia in big women. I might come to the induction part of that in a moment, but yeah. Yeah. So any other issues about ultrasound scans?
Gabrielle McGrath from the Women's. At what gestation would you recommend morphology scans?
Yeah, so that's the guideline as it's written at the moment says 20 to 23 weeks, which means do whatever you want. The reason for that is, so historically, I think the original guideline suggested 22 weeks, but as scan capabilities have improved, that the challenge with doing it later is your ability to intervene if there is a significant fetal abnormality that a family might choose to terminate. And so our policy at Sunshine is going to be actually to go back to the more standard 20-week time rather than a little bit later. Yep. So I think it's probably going to be influenced by what your local service can actually do, because these scans are challenging scans. Yeah. About 30% of our women that have a scan outside our hospital end up having to have a second scan at whatever level of obesity, because they can't complete the morphology scan because of mum's body habitus, as they often put on the report, which I think is a bit of a cop-out at times, but that's what we're dealing with. So, all right, nothing else about ultrasound scans? Simple. Probably the most contentious recommendation in the guideline, unless Chris is thinking of other ones that I can't think of, is around the consideration of doing things a little bit differently towards the end of pregnancy. I suspect some of you were at the MCG back in May, and you will have seen a graph that I often show people showing the extraordinary influence that BMI has on stillbirth risk, and that risk really takes off when you go beyond your due date. It's directly linked to your BMI. So for each BMI category, the risk goes up quite considerably. And whilst we don't have any randomized control data that induction at a point that I'll come back to is beneficial, we are now moving to a point where there are some data coming out of the states where they've instituted policies of doing things a little bit earlier and showing some better outcomes. If stillbirth is what you're worried about, then for women with a very high BMI, so I'm talking 50 and over, going beyond 39 weeks, if you look at the risk data, seems a fairly dangerous thing to be doing. And so in the guideline, and I actually can't remember the exact wording, but it's a consideration of induction at 38 to 39 weeks for women with a BMI over 40, and delivery by 39 weeks for women with a BMI over 50. Now, the 50 group, to be honest, for most of you is not a particular issue. That's a small group of women if you look at the statewide figures. But plenty of services have got looking after women with BMI over 40. So I think it is something to consider. What does it mean? Well, induction in this group is challenging. They take longer to induce. Obese mums labour longer, so we have to turn around our normals for how we treat women with a high BMI, the contention around it, which I'm sure you're all very sensitive about, and the bit I missed this morning was around induction and whether there was any discussion around caesarean risk. We don't know in women who are obese what the implications are of induction and caesarean, but we do know that women that remain pregnant have a rapidly rising risk of stillbirth. So that's the logic behind that recommendation, but again, it's not evidence, so it's certainly not level 1 evidence. Are there anxieties about that? Any other panel comments?
I'd just like to make a point about, given that the morbidity associated with increased intervention rates in labour, caesarean section, difficult vaginal deliveries, at what point, I would like to know, is it reasonable to offer a caesarean section?
Yeah. So there has been some data come out in the last 5 years or so that has suggested that overall you're probably worth an induction rather than an elective caesarean. But I think it does depend a little bit on the circumstances. But the evidence has driven us more towards saying that actually there's this concept of there's 3 ways you can give birth, vaginally and its various permutations, or an emergency Caesar or an elective Caesar. The one of those 3 you really don't want is an emergency caesarean. But actually putting it all together, it seems to be that it is an attempt at induction and as normal a birth as you can manage is a reasonable option. Yeah. And I think the wording actually says that in the guideline. Yeah.
Oh,
Just
Glenn. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, just
Hello.
moving on from that. Sorry, can I just ask VBACs in women with BMIs over 40, do you counsel differently? And if so, how?
Yeah, I counsel very, very differently. So, how long have I got?
Yeah, as long as
10 minutes.
Yeah,
All right.
10 minutes.
So,
Going
I think counselling in VBAC is a challenging situation anyway. So just park obesity conversations for a moment. When we counsel women about the success of an attempted vaginal birth after caesarean, we often seem to quote figures that are unachievable in Victorian hospitals largely. So we often quote 70, 80, 85, and I've heard 90% being told. And that's not correct for what happens in most organisations. Most organisations would be pleased with themselves if they achieved a 50% success rate. There are lots of hospitals that achieve considerably less than that. And so when you're going to counsel about VBAC with women who are above a healthy weight, you have to bear in mind that firstly, are you quoting figures for a healthy weighted woman's outcome? And then you have to take that figure and drastically reduce it. Because there is absolutely no doubt that the success rate for women who are obese, and I'm using a 30 cutoff here, and above, dramatically go down. If your BMI is over 40, there are plenty of studies now that have shown that your success rate is less than 15, that's 15%. That means you have an 85% chance of an emergency caesarean. And the one thing you really don't want to have in a woman with a high BMI is an emergency caesarean, particularly if her BMI is over 40. And I think we should be giving that information to women and explaining that it's not quite what they might read on the internet, around 70, 80 or 90% success rates. And if they take that on board, absolutely fine. You can have the conversation, I think, around the precautions that we should be taking in the context of any VBAC. But you do just need to make sure that you've had that conversation. Did that answer the question? Yeah. Sorry, question. Oh, sorry. How are you?
Hello, Glenn. I'm Chris Smith from Goulburn Valley Health, Shepparton. Glenn, with the new guide that you're working on, for the hospitals that don't have the pressure to monitor the contractions, what will you be advising?
Yeah. So there's no easy answer to this. So the guideline, I don't think actually specifically mentions what to do about it because nobody quite knows. There are strong advocates of intrauterine pressure monitors, and lots of places that have tried them have stopped using them. Anybody routinely using pressure monitors? Stick your hand in the air. Okay. So, what is that? One hospital? Yeah. So not a lot. Having said that, there are some newer pressure monitors that may be useful. There are also newer CTG approaches that are coming onto the market that may make it a lot easier to actually monitor the fetal heart. But it's a real challenge, and there's no easy answer to it.
Kate from Kilmore, just stepping a little bit outside of the guidance and asking more about referral pathways to your facility. Regional Victoria has a very large incidence of obesity. We certainly don't care for women that have a BMI of 40. So if they're at antenatal clinic at 35, we're already counselling them to go elsewhere. How do we work with somebody like you? Is there opportunities for collaboration, that they stay with us antenatally for some of their care, or what would that look like?
Yeah, so there's certainly nothing in the guideline about it. There are references to organisations determining their capability to look after women at various thresholds. The guideline as it stands will not have specific thresholds that obligate transfer. I'm just going to ask you one question before I reply. When you say you're talking to women at BMI of 35 about them needing to go because you can't manage women with a BMI over 40,
Yep.
Did I hear you correctly? Okay. So there is reference to that in the guideline, and I think there is a lot of misunderstanding about that. The risk profile that we all talk about is based on early pregnancy BMI.
Yeah.
And so if we're doing the 35 to 40 jump, we're actually, I think, probably transferring some women inappropriately, because the risk is based, when we look at the data, we should be looking at that early pregnancy BMI. Now, there will be some influences on that because it depends on your capability in terms of doing epidurals and various other things. But it's just worth taking that into account. Now, a paper that's come out of Sunshine and the Women's and a few other places has just shown that you can actually add around about 5 BMI figures on. So if your normal threshold would be 40, you may be better off working towards 45 than working as a cutoff. The other thing to say is no organisation can say they can't look after a woman of a certain BMI because she'll walk in off the street in labour. And that happens, and so you have to be able to cope with that. So I don't think it's possible to say we can't. It's about saying we'll try not to, but in the event of, what are we going to do?
Okay.
Did I answer the rest of the question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks.
Sorry, my question is very similar. Last year, working on the Queensland pregnancy health record, there were some people who wanted to put a 36-week BMI record in there, and then there were other members saying there's no evidence. It's the pre-pregnancy record weight, BMI. And then just recently speaking to the local obstetrician, pre-pregnancy BMI of 39, how will we manage this woman? And he was sort of, that bigger picture stuff, depends how much weight she puts on in the pregnancy, all of that sort of stuff. So it is a lot of different opinions out there. So what have you guys found as your research recommendation?
Yeah, so I think the wording in the guideline alludes to the fact that the risk is assessed on the basis of, it's actually, we often use the term pre-pregnancy BMI, which is a made-up figure. So it's early pregnancy BMI, and we should all be routinely doing it. I was interested, I'm sure a lot of you have seen, there are, each organisation I think recently has been sent their BMI profile, and you'll see that on those graphs there's a significant number of women in the state of Victoria that there are no BMI data recorded, which seems quite odd, because I would have thought by now we're all routinely actually measuring and checking height and weighing women at their first visit. But the risk profile is based on that early visit. It's hard to say much more than that about it.
Well, it is a very contentious issue. I was involved with Gippsland when they were trying to set up some BMI guidelines. That was one of the things that really polarised people, was BMI booking or BMI at 36 weeks. And one of the groups that were most adamant about it were in fact the anaesthetists. So they felt it had to be at 36 weeks. And the problem with that is then you try to send somebody down to a large centre that is already overbooked. You see a woman for the first time when she's at 36 weeks, she doesn't want to be there, and we don't really want her. Just simply because, in fact, you're already full of people there and you don't have the chance to give her any ongoing care. So it really is very difficult. But we have been talking about, booking BMI for a long time, and maybe that's a very important message to get across.
Yeah.
And just in regards to induction versus elective caesarean section, do you think, in fact, a hospital should look at its capacity to look after these very people, and particularly for emergency caesar, and say, look, that's something we have difficulty with our personnel at a night or whatever, and we may have to do an elective caesarean section. Do you think other factors need to come into play?
I think it would be a reasonable consideration. Yeah. I mean, if your response, particularly if we went back to the VBAC argument, if your 2 o'clock in the morning alert caesarean response time is an hour, that would make me anxious about undertaking a VBAC in those circumstances for a woman who is above a healthy weight, because you've got about an 85% of her BMI is over 40 that she'll need an emergency caesarean. Not necessarily an alert, but a lot of those will be scary CTG Caesars. So why would you put yourselves and that woman in that situation? I think it needs considering.
Glenn, I'm sorry, and I'm not sure if I've missed it, but is there anything about transferring obese women in labour? That used to happen a lot up in Cairns. The smaller centres would send women. They'd often deliver on the side of the road, which would be the worst outcome of all. So it wasn't really risk management, it was risk avoidance. And women will potentially hide out in rural or regional areas knowing that they'll be told to relocate elsewhere. And if they're a long way away from a large hospital, they'll present to the smaller one. Do you have any advice about not transferring women, or at what point it's safe to do so?
I suppose that's what I was alluding to when I said you're going to end up having to look after a woman in that situation, and transferring just on the basis of a weight threshold seems to be adding risk, not managing risk. So, what always surprises me is actually some of the transport vehicle weight limits are not what I always thought they might be. There are some width issues, but the fixed wing's 120 kilos. That's not a lot. So anyway, I was always surprised when I look at that table. But yeah, that's why I think you have to be prepared, particularly as a rural service, to say, well, what would we do if we are presented with the situation of somebody with a BMI 45 in the middle of the night? How are we going to manage it?
Well, that happened in Western Victoria 2 years ago. A woman who was sent to online centre who lived on the side of the road. And I think the problem is we're all a bit frightened by these women because, in fact, they're daunting. In the middle of the night, you've got, I always say, and it's probably a bit facetiously, we always seem to have the smallest registrars on. We have the biggest women. And, just getting them on the theatre table, if you don't have all the equipment, is very difficult. And so I think I think we've all got to be honest. In fact, there's some of the most challenging women we look after, put aside the heart valves, everything else, they really are difficult because you have so little control. Anyway, thank you very much. So watch this space. So the obesity guideline will be coming. We just need to look at it a bit more carefully.
Over to you. I've done my bit.